This radio broadcast is brought to you by Channel Grim Grin, the only YouTube channel starring both Grim and Grin. Good evening, children. And trust me, in the eyes of us immortals, you are all children. Deadly Headley speaking to you from beyond the rusted gate. Dim your lights, turn off your monitors, and say your prayers. For when the crypt fails and the mind shatters, the only thing standing between us and the beyond is the rusted gate. Tonight's story from beyond is read to you by the master of scare himself, Sir Darkwell Bled. But first, like all journeys, you must take the first step through the threshold. So go on through, my child. Go on through, beyond the rusted gate.
There is a place where ancient ruins give out to modern ruins, which in turn open into bustling streets of contemporary art, elegant eateries, and dilapidated slums. Where a 2-minute walk can take you from a palace to a crack house and back. Where, in the height of summer, it rains black coolant on the footpaths from leaking air conditioners above. Where democracy was born, history lives, and flea markets thrive. This place, usually known as Athens in the year 2032, is today located beyond the rusted gate. Our story follows two travellers, Mary and David, both in their mid-20s and both considerably more out of their depths than they realise. Having just arrived in Greece via aircraft, the two travel companions had taken the train to Ammonia Square. Surrounded by several pleasant eateries, Ammonia Square has, as a train stop, the distinct advantage of being a 5-minute walk from the pair's hotel. The first half of this walk is a straight path past fancy yet inexpensive restaurants. The second half, following a sharp left turn, is a filthy street in which garbage conquered the footpaths long ago, and those who prefer the night's company had taken the street as their residence. None of this was in itself sinister. Stockpiled garbage was a council matter, Mary thought, and her and David themselves were not without some love for the nightlife. Besides, both Mary and David had travelled far too much, and were, they proudly held, far too well adjusted to believe living in the slums was a reflection of character, rather than simply a reflection of current economical hardships. Nevertheless, Mary and David did not walk so slow as they would have if strolling a park, and quickly found themselves safely in their hotel. The hotel, Mary marvelled, was not a reflection of economic hardship. Much like most of Athens, it boasted large quantities of marble decorations, covering both the entire floor of the hotel foyer and the narrow stairwell. Their room, the hostel section of the hotel, and positioned on the 7th floor, was relatively small and cramped, especially considering it housed 4 beds, but it was clean, cosy, and considerably better than the accommodation they had found themselves in Paris. They introduced themselves to their roommate, a Norwegian man who would be leaving in the morning, he informed them, and freshened themselves up following their long flight. "Not much of a view," Mary heard David remark from the balcony as she splashed water on her face. "No," she replied, joining him on the small overlook. "It's a great view of that vacant block of land," Mary added in jest, as she motioned to the overgrown garbage-filled empty block that stood in stark contrast to the elegant marble of their hotel. As her eyes studied the block, they passed over an object that her eyes, or possibly her mind, could not fully comprehend. And for reasons she could not quite place, Mary was struck with a tidal wave of primordial fear. With effort, Mary mustered a calm demeanour, pointed to the jet-black, non-distinct lump that had so disturbed her, and in a deliberate but forced nonchalant manner inquired as to David, "What do you reckon that is?" Obviously not too disturbed himself, David waved off the object to be probably just a pile of trash, helpfully adding, "or something." But so far as Mary was concerned, just a pile of trash did not quite explain the knots of fear that had tied themselves within her stomach, nor why, when they would pass the vacant block of land only half an hour later, The jet-black object that had troubled her so much was nowhere to be seen. Part 2. Mary awoke to a sound and feeling that one would imagine is akin to the rushing wind felt when falling 6 foot down a well, only to land on your back, wide-eyed, and in an uncomfortable hostel bed. This all-too-familiar feeling Mary had come to associate with waking up after foolishly getting blackout drunk. Still clothed in her outfit from the night before, Mary quickly slapped her pockets and was relieved to find her wallet, phone, and passport were all still there. Looking over at the adjacent bunk bed, she was surprised to see that not only the Norwegian, but David too, were not. At breakfast, Mary began the arduous task of piecing together the events of a debaucherously drunken night. They had passed the lot of land while on their way to find a pub. That much she remembered. The object was not there, she had noted. Was David wearing his backpack? Well, he must have been, because this morning showed no trace of him, with neither David nor his backpack present in the dorm. They had then found a bar, and half a litre of wine was just €2. That's where Mary's memory got pretty hazy. Was there a girl? It's entirely possible David went home with a girl, which, if he had it with him, would explain the missing backpack. And if he had drunk as much as she had herself, it would explain why David had yet to return or message her. Mary sighed heavily. She was glad her friend had had a good night, but was not about to waste one of her few days in Athens waiting for David to wake up from a drunken stupor. She texted him to ask how his head was, and to contact her when he woke up, and began to make plans for the day. There was one more thing she remembered. She strained to grasp at the memory through the night's drunken fog and morning's pounding headache, and was greeted by something that made her shudder. Standing on the balcony last night, staring down at the vacant lot, she remembered that the object was back. What's more, she recalled in horror, that a passing motor vehicle had shone its lights on the object while rounding a corner. The object itself remained pitch black, but as the ground surrounding it was illuminated, it became apparent that the object was a figure. Crouched, sitting upright in a fetal position, and entirely jet black even in the headlights, was a creature of inhuman proportions, with spindly, spider-like legs, and despite the brightness, had no discernible features. Mary did not usually dream, let alone suffer nightmares when blacked out, but sitting there now in the hotel's kitchen, she found herself praying that this had been a rare exception. Part 3. After a cleansing shower, Mary set out to explore Athens, and somewhere between the Acropolis and Hadrian's Arch, the disturbing imagery of her dream, as she attempted to convince herself, was mostly pushed out of her mind. Due to a mixture of concern and the draining effects a hangover has on one's body over the course of a day, Mary found herself back in the dormitory as early as 6 p.m. The other 2 beds were still empty, and there was still no sign of David. Making sure the door to the balcony was closed with blinds drawn shut, Mary sent one last text message to David and turned in for the evening. That night, many of the city's stray dogs went missing. The dogs went missing, and Mary had a nightmare. Standing on the balcony that overlooked the vacant lot, Mary saw darkness. No lights shone through the windows of the surrounding buildings, and even the lonely street light that had coughed an ineffectually dull light at the end of the street stood in a curtain of shadow. Suddenly, brilliant flash after flash lit the surroundings purple, as an unnatural thunderstorm raged silently in the smoggy skies above. Then, completely against Mary's own strained will, she found her eyes slowly wandering from the shelves of vacant apartments across from her to the empty lot below. For a moment, they were completely concealed by merciful darkness. But as the sky lit up once more, Mary was met with horrors beyond horrors as she witnessed not one, but 2 jet-black figures in the lot, slowly raised from their crouched positions, motions joltingly exaggerated by the strobe light of the raging storm. Mary screamed and woke up in her room, greeted by morning. David was still missing. And unlike her previous morning, Mary now struggled to forget, not remember, her visions from the night before. It was now 8 a.m, and Mary had been for the last hour in an Athenian police station. The station could easily have been mistaken as a tattoo parlour or a dive bar. Between two dilapidated buildings and on a street just as dodgy as the one her hotel was found, the only thing that marked this building apart from those surrounding it was that the men on the street outside at all hours of the day were in uniform. Mary had decided that the time for texting was over and had called David, only to be met with a digital voice telling her his phone was turned off. David's phone being turned off is exactly what would happen if David had neglected to charge it for the last 2 days. The only issue being that neglecting to charge his phone, especially while travelling, and especially while Mary would be trying to contact him, is exactly something David would not do. Well, he's probably fine, Mary told police, feeling certain he was not. And I'm probably just overreacting, she added, feeling certain she wasn't. Knowing full well that making such statements downplayed the danger David may be in, Mary still felt compelled to make them, in an effort to preserve her own psyche. And regardless, the police, after some issue with language barriers, did take David's picture at the end, promising to keep their eyes out for him. So now Mary found herself wandering the back streets of Athens, too worried to eat, and feeling that any sightseeing would be somewhat disrespectful to her friend, who may be in real danger, very real danger. She instead found herself simply walking with no real direction, telling herself she could at any moment come across David standing at a market stall in one of these sporadically placed flea markets that dotted the city, or eating in one of the table and chair restaurant setups that graced the Athenian sidewalks. After a full day of this attempted positive thinking and directionless trudging, Mary looked up to find herself back in front of the vacant lot next to her hotel. Noting that it was still void of the figures from her nightmares, and half wondering if the object, before it had been identified as a figure, had even been there before David had gone missing, or if the memory of David and her both seeing it was too a dream that she had misdiagnosed as reality, Mary went past the overgrown square and up to her bed in room 3, level 7. Despite her attempts at rationalizing the figures as nothing but figments of her imagination, and despite her concern for David dominating almost all of her thoughts, Mary still made sure to close the balcony door and pull the curtains before sleeping. She was, she noted, still the only person in the room, and yet she was unsure if the door and blinds had been open when she woke up following her nightmare. Mary had been so concerned that David had not returned that despite her troubling visions, she had taken no notice of the balcony that morning. She liked to think that it had been closed and was opened during the day by a cleaner in an attempt to air out the small door. Repeating this thought to herself as fact, Mary settled in for her final night. That night, the feral cat population of Athens dropped significantly. The feral cat population dropped, and Mary had a nightmare. Standing at the open door to the balcony, the jet-black figure of inhuman proportions hunched. It hunched because at full height the creature could not have stood straight. The creature was so dark in form that it stood clearly silhouetted by the night sky as a blackness only visible due to the view it masked. The figure made no noise, except a dull thudding, which quickened in terror as Mary realized the noise the creature emitted was a reflection of her own pulse. The jungle beat of her heart broadcast by the figure continued to quicken as Mary struggled to move, feeling as if all the world's oxygen had turned to mud, which now slowed her motions and choked her lungs. Mary was now as an unwound clock, operating out of time with the rest of the world. With effort, she managed to escape the bed, and mustering her strength, turned her eyes from the horrid figure towards the exit, only to find it obscured by the second dark figure. It too thundered her heartbeat, which now pounded painfully in her chest as the beast slowly closed in towards her. Defiantly, Mary span back around, finding the first figure had too begun to close. The tempo of their thunderous drums were too much for Mary. They were a painful burn that burst her chest and deafened her ears until suddenly the source of their broadcast gave out and Mary collapsed. At 9 p.m, Oscar and Ashley checked into their hotel and set themselves up in room 3 on the 7th floor. The building was in a fairly dodgy neighbourhood, but the hotel itself was quite nice. Ashley went into the bathroom to freshen up after her long flight and began splashing water across her face. "Not much of a view," Oscar commented from the balcony. Joining him, Ashley looked down at the overgrown square and shuddered with a feeling of dread she couldn't quite explain. "What do you suppose those are?" she asked, pointing towards 3 non-distinct, jet-black objects in the overgrown, garbage-filled, vacant block below.